Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on which part of the world you're joining us from. And welcome to Knowledge Connexions 2020. I'm George Anatiotis. I'm part of the core organizing team for the event, which is a joint venture coming to you from Connected Data London and the Knowledge Graph Conference. And this is actually the first session that we have in the whole event. This is the first day of workshops, and this is the first workshop in which we have a great team of people who are going to be dissecting all the latest and greatest developments in SEO and knowledge graphs with a little sprinkle of natural language processing and AI in the process. So you're up for a really good time if this is your thing, and obviously it should be since you're here. Just a few words, as you know, this is the first session for our event as well. You know, I don't really have to explain to anyone, I guess, you know, how hard 2020 has been for all of us. So this is, but, you know, we're trying to make the best of it. And this is traditionally the time of year that in Connected Data London, we have our flagship event. And so, you know, we didn't let this hard year keep us back. And this is our way of doing it, you know, again, in the best way we can. So online instead of actually face-to-face, but, you know, on the upside, this also gives us the chance to have like a dream team together today with us. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce David Amerland, who is the moderator for this workshop. And just in ways of introduction, I was just telling David earlier that it may be a good thing actually to refer a little to how we met, because I think it's actually relevant for this workshop. So, and it gives an idea of how knowledge graphs mean different things to different people and how you can approach it from a different angle. So as some of you may know, one of the hats I wear is a contributor for ZDNet, and at some point, I had written an article which had to do with knowledge graphs, and David read it, and I guess it kind of seemed interesting to him, and so he sent me a message basically saying that, well, you know, what you're saying doesn't really make much sense. And I saw it, you know, and quickly checked his background, and I realized, okay, so this person actually knows what he's talking about, but I also know what I'm talking about, so there must be some kind of misunderstanding here. So he probably means something else when he refers to knowledge graphs than what I refer to when I use the term knowledge graphs. So this was the beginning of a wonderful friendship, and also a very good example of how semantics come into play when you talk about knowledge graphs in specific, but also more broadly. So David also wears a number of hats. He's an author. He's also into data mining. He does consulting. A man of many talents, including SEO and knowledge graphs, which is why he's here moderating this workshop. So I'm going to give him the floor, but before I do, one last thing, and you know, I'm going to basically I'm going to quietly sit in the background from now on, but just for the benefit of people who are watching. So, you know, this being an online panel, we thought the best way to design the interaction with you, because we want to keep things interactive, but we also don't want to break the flow of people having a conversation. So my job here will be basically to try and, you know, try to serve both of these goals. So while our guests are having their conversation, you can type in questions, comments, or feedback, or, you know, you can also feel free to chat amongst yourselves as well, using this nice little chat box that you see on the right part of the screen, the bottom right part of the screen. So this chat box there is moderated, you know, just in case people start typing crazy things, with I don't really believe, but, you know, better be safe than sorry. And then basically what you can do is, you know, like I said, you can chat with each other, you can type in questions for other people in our panel, or feedback, or, you know, what have you. And my job will be basically to keep an eye on that. And at certain points when a discussion theme has been completed, David is going to stop the conversation and converse with me, and then at that point I will basically relay questions and feedback and comments to David so that they can be taken up to the panel. So that's it. My talking part basically ends here, and then David, the floor is yours, and you can introduce everyone in the panel.
David, we don't hear you.
Yeah, probably muted.
Okay,
No
can you
worries.
hear me now?
Yes,
Okay, the button on my microphone, okay. Thank you very much for that introduction. And certainly, when we talk about knowledge graphs, there's always a lot of confusion. It's been about almost 20 years since the semantic web was first mentioned. It's been about just over 10 years, almost 10 years since knowledge graphs started coming into play. And we have now artificial intelligence across the web being used in SEO, and nobody's really none the wiser how all these things actually clarify at the point of practical application. Now, we have a brilliant panel. I'm going to introduce each person in turn. We start with Andrea Volpini. He's a CEO and founder of WordLift, a company that helps brands increase their visibility. They make use of semantic web technologies and artificial intelligence to promote that activity. We have Hamlet Batista. He's a CEO at RankSense, an agile SEO platform for online retailers and manufacturers. We have Dawn Anderson, who's a managing director of an SEO consultancy and digital marketing agency named Verti. And last but not least, we have Jason Barnard, founder of CaliQ. He specializes in brand SERPs and knowledge panels. And personally, I've seen him run a number of very interesting experiments when it comes to SEO. All right, what we're going to do is we're going to start a discussion on this, take a few questions, field a few questions which have to do with knowledge graphs. We'll go around the panel, get everybody's experience. The focus here is on practicality. And as George has already mentioned, as questions come up, please put them in the chat and we'll address them to the panel. So let's start the first one. Now, when we talk about knowledge graphs, right, what are we talking about actually? What are knowledge graphs? And let's take this question with Andrea first, please.
Okay, so a knowledge graph, in simple terms, is a data structure, and it's a data structure that connects one node to another node through an edge, and this edge is what creates the information. So the way in which we specify the connection is the way in which we convey information into our graph. Okay,
and that's a great almost textbook definition of a knowledge graph.
I didn't read it, huh?
If we're talking about the practicalities, though, if you're the average person who's thinking about, okay, I need to improve my SEO, I understand that knowledge graphs are really important now, and I need to grasp what does that mean in terms of what I do. So how would we translate a node and an edge to that person? And maybe, go on, please.
Yeah, so in SEO terms, then these edges would become the property of the entity, and these properties are part of types, and each type has its own set of attributes. So in SEO terms, you want to understand what type you are, right? Are you representing yourself as a person? Are you representing yourself as a doctor, as a company? And what type of facets do you want to show of your entity? Because at the end, SEO is about marketing whatever you do best. And
okay, I mean that's a very practical example which you just gave.
So I was going to say,
yes,
David, I read something recently in a book about natural language and knowledge graphs.
Okay.
And there's a term, as we know, which is literally is a. So I think Andrea's alluding to always considering what is a thing. It literally is the word is a. So whenever, for instance, we produce content, we constantly think about this is a, if that makes sense. So yeah, it seems to be mentioned a lot in books on ontology that the word is a together. So literally the three letters.
Mm-hmm. And I'm very glad you brought this up. And that's inevitably when we start talking about knowledge graphs, we have to grapple a little bit of terminology. Already we've got entities and we've got ontologies coming up. So let's take the next sort of demystifying question to Jason. Jason, what is an entity, please?
Ooh, nice question. An entity is a thing It's something you can define: a person, a place, a road, a house, a dog. In fact, that was for Dawn, the dog example. Or, in fact, a concept such as economics. And I think kind of we tend to forget those as entities. Economics is an entity. It's something we can define and we can name. And the idea of entities, I mean, with Andrea at WordLift, we've been doing entity-based content models, and I hope we're going to dig into that because it's incredibly interesting, the idea that when we create our content, if we start thinking in terms of entities and their properties and their attributes and the relationships to other entities, we start to really, really get to the core of what it is we're talking about, the topics and why, where we are situated within our market and vis-a-vis our audience.
You mentioned properties when it comes to entities. Can you clarify that a little bit? And how do we define that?
Ooh, well, I mean, it was Andrea who said properties earlier on. I was just repeating stupidly what he had said. I mean, I've been using my podcast as an example because that's part of this experiment. I have a series, a creative work series, and the type of series is a podcast series, and within that series I have multiple podcast episodes, and the episodes actually have properties which Andrea can now explain.
Okay, so let's go to Andrea on this one, and then we're going to have to go to Hamlet next, please. Okay, Andrea, please.
Yeah, give me a minute.
What I don't know. I mean, when
we talk about properties, right? What are properties? How would you define properties of an entity?
So the properties are, the attributes that specify, a set of information. So, for instance, in the case of the podcast, the core property, of course, is it's the title of the podcast. That's the content that people will look for. But then again, it's the edge that conveys the real value behind the podcast. And one of the most important edges is whoever Jason is interviewing. And so the relationship between the two person, the author and the contributor, is what's creating the uniqueness of that piece of content. And I think it's interesting that we already moved from the knowledge graph in the context of Google to the knowledge graph in the context of Jason website. And that's I think it's an interesting also jump, because I mean, when we talk about knowledge graph, usually people tend to think about Google's knowledge graph, especially in the context of SEO. Yeah. But I think now we are mature enough that we also talk about our own knowledge graph. Okay. And I think Hamlet also has done a lot of interesting experiment to build knowledge graphs, which is...
Yeah, I'm sorry about Andrea. I thought that's kind of where David was coming from. He was saying, like, what is a knowledge graph and how does it apply to us personally? And for us personally, it comes down to what WordLift are doing, which is saying build your internal knowledge graph. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead, Don. I
was going to say, ultimately, knowledge graph as a term has been popularized by Google. Mm-hmm. I remember last year when I was at the web conference in San Francisco, one of the Google ontologists was quite ranty when he was talking about how actually knowledge graphs per se and the whole semantic web and the semantic structure, semantic data has been around a very, very, very long time. Ever since Sir Tim Berners-Lee talked of linked connected data. But obviously Google have massively popularized the whole thing. Mm-hmm. So knowledge graph as an actual thing per se is quite a loose term, really. And on to your point about attributes, I would compare that with classes of things, and back to the whole is a thing, is, a vehicle is a car is a vehicle and a bike is a vehicle, and I don't know if that makes sense.
It does in a way, and I'm going to take this question now to Hamlet. And one of the things which we brought up or haven't really dug into is ontologies. And Don's point on classes comes into that. Hamlet, you're going to talk a little bit about ontologies. What are they? How are they created? How do they differ from a taxonomy?
Yeah, I wanted to first, because you didn't get to contribute to the first conversation, the first interaction, is I felt like we were too high level, too abstract in the definition, and I wanted to make a simple, layman terms, explanation of what are these knowledge graphs, what is this semantic ontologies and all this stuff, right? And I think with examples, right? With examples, it's very easy to understand. And I want to mention a specific case where she's trying to address ambiguity, right? So you have, for example, Abraham Lincoln, right? Okay. And you could say, oh, is that the person, right? Or is that the bridge, right? Mm-hmm. Or I mean the tunnel, right? Or the university, right? So the same name, the same label, right, could be used to express different things that are completely different, right? So how do you disambiguate, right? And then we get into the the uses of natural language and stuff like that. But take that idea, right? How can you, for a human, you would know that by the context, you can understand what it is, right? Because you're using exactly the same label for something that is completely different things. And that's where the attributes of that thing come into place. But instead of talking about attributes, let's talk about what that thing is capable of doing, being, or, So a person, right? Oh, it's going to be walking, it's going to be, and that's where Andreas was talking about the edges, right? So when you look at the entity, which is the label, and you look at the capabilities of that label, you can tell that whether it is a bridge, whether it's a university, or whether it's a person, because a bridge is not going to have the same capabilities of a person, right? That's how you, in simple layman terms, can understand it, right? So you get from the academics into, oh, how do I can understand this? Now these objects, these attributes, these classes, all that stuff makes a lot more sense.
But sometimes, even when we're talking about the same person, understanding the things they do or say or whatever, it's not always enough, because, for instance, we say Mozart, whereas other people use the full name, initials, and so there is, within the actual entity determination itself of the thing.
Yeah, but that is
further and further ambiguous. Yeah, but you're right.
That is a different problem, because it still is the same person.
Yeah,
right?
named entity determination.
It doesn't matter whether you use abbreviation or anything. It's the same thing, right? Because if you're talking about Mozart, it's gonna be has a birthday. It's gonna have you are gonna be able to tell unambiguously that that's the person because of the attributes of that person, right? And it doesn't matter how it's labeled with abbreviations or first or last name or whatever. You're going to know that that's the person because of all the attributes of that person.
Yeah, combined. Yeah, no, I agree. Combined.
The parents and everything, right?
Okay,
and that's the beauty of it. That's the beauty of it, that you're able to identify things by all the things
with
that
everything else, of course. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So you're able to tell who you are by the company that it keeps.
Of course.
That's another way to see it, right? So that's what I say, that's a very simple way to understand the whole concept when you're trying to disambiguate it.
And I think for our audience, if they're thinking at the most basic level, I think amongst the four of you, you've created a very multi-layered approach that comes down to what it does. So if you're creating content, for instance, that needs to be as less ambiguous as possible, as clear as possible, clearly describing what that content, or rather the thing which you put in your content, actually does, as every one of the panelists has mentioned, will help create that clarity of approach, which helps create a particular entity out of your content, so that a search engine knows what you're referring to, and an audience reading that can clearly understand what you're actually talking about. So I think that's actually a very good way. And we've seen in the discussion between Hamlet and Dawn and Andrea and Jason, that there, on top of all that, there are levels of what we would call perhaps academic interest, because when you dig into an entity at an SEO level, the technicalities are quite immense. Okay, don't mention Mozart. She mentioned that when you actually create the entity and you create it properly at a technical level, there's a lot of things which you need to actually take into account. Hamlet's approach that, you basically describe what that does, helps you understand how you connect the high-level approach to the practicalities of it. And I think that's brilliant. Okay, let's talk a little bit about context now, because essentially context is how search is evolving in every different application. And that also helps the evolution of knowledge graphs. So really the question, which is slightly broad and hopefully will narrow it down in its definitions, is how does context now begin to change the applications of knowledge graphs? How does that now affect search engine optimization in the broader sense? So if we just sort of take it to each person in turn, I'll start in reverse this time with Hamlet, please.
Yeah. So, and we can talk about, and we can't talk about context in search without talking about BERT,
Okay.
BERT is.
We'll have to explain what BERT is here as well.
Exactly. So BERT is, it's a new encode. It's a natural language processing encoding mechanism, right? That allows more granular interpretation of text. So you can have a sequence of text, and the machine, what it does is it turns that into embeddings, into numbers. Once the text is turned into numbers, machines can do very easy. The simplest approach, the simplest application is similarities, right? So you can take two sentences. How old are you and what is your age? Those are two phrases that are semantically similar. But if you use a traditional approach of matching text, they wouldn't be looking like similar. If you're just trying to match word by word, they wouldn't look similar. But a technique, like BERT, can identify that these two phrases are very closely related. And that is able to do that by context, right? And BERT works at a word level. What I describe is at a sentence level. BERT works at a word level. And that example that I gave of, Abraham Lincoln, in the text, BERT will be able to clearly label the person versus the bridge or the university by the other words in the sentence. So you have a full sentence, the word is not going to be using the other words in the sentence, allow the search engine to know, this word, Abraham Lincoln, and this sentence means the man. This one means the tunnel, right? Because of the other words are in the sentence, right? And the context, as I said, the words before and after is what makes this available. And BERT is able to check the context. Before BERT, it was only checking the words before or the words after. BERT is able to check both of them at the same time with a, right?
So to popularize this a little bit, like BERT essentially is a context sensitizer for search.
Exactly. And the embeddings, the BERT embeddings are context sensitive. So essentially, it creates, and I use an analogy which is using GPS, which is very simple to understand, right? Mm-hmm. So you have a physical location. You can express a location by, the name of the business or the street address, or you can use the GPS coordinates to know that location what location it is. BERT is similar, right? So BERT gives a coordinate for every word, and the coordinates change by the context. So depending on the context, you're going to have a different location.
Excellent. Andrea, you can take it from here. Just, anything you can add to this.
Well, I mean, the analysis of the context does also take a lot into account the geographical location of the user. And I think this is quite interesting in the knowledge graph, because we see, the same entity that can be represented in different ways depending on where the user is making the search. So if you look for my company here in Rome, then you will get the local panel and the direction to reach the office. But then if you look from where you are, abroad, then you will see, you know, the description of a, you know, software organization. So I think that the context is of course a mix of the user intent, so what the user is trying to express, and a lot of other, you know, parameters that help Google understand the information that it's more effective at that point in time. Excellent.
Okay, that's fantastic. And Dawn, again, anything you need to add to this in terms of context and BERT? Well, you've written extensively on BERT, I know that.
Yeah, it's such an intriguing topic. I'm going to be really quick here. But, you know, rooting around, I know BERT's great, etc., but it seems now that there are even, you know, bigger and better things than BERT per se out there. A really interesting one is T5 by Google, which is, you know, BERT was trained on the original BERT was trained on Wikipedia, the English version of Wikipedia, and the Brown corpus, I think it was, a book corpus. So a lot of words, but Google's T5, which is just kind of a more recent model, an extension upon BERT, that was trained on the Common Crawl, which is petabytes of data going back 7 years and much more aligned with the web and natural language. And obviously all of these things are continually trained on questions and answers like MS Marco and Google's natural questions. So BERT is great, but BERT's really just the beginning of things to come, you know, and especially when it comes to things like internationalization of search as well, because we all know about programmers English, the whole web, and the fact that English is far more popular than the number of people who are English, if you like.
Yes.
And that's a problem because it presents a massive bias online. So in reality now, the big focus, I would say, going into this year really is, I know Microsoft, Facebook and Google are doing a lot of stuff with these BERT type models to translate it into lots and lots, 100 different languages, for instance, without having to rely on English as the intermediate translator. So I think there's going to be a huge amount of other stuff that will go well beyond BERT in the very, very near future.
Excellent.
I wanted to mention that T5 was on a clean version of Common Crawl. They call it
Yeah,
C4.
exactly. All those swear words were stripped out of it and the code. So
Yeah. C4, yeah, they call it.
yeah, C4. Yeah.
Well, also clean Common Crawl.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Yeah.
They come up with some funny names.
All right, let's go to Jason. And Jason, please tell us a little bit again about context.
Well, I mean, what struck me when all that went through was something, coming back to what Hamlet was saying earlier on, is however good they get, they're never going to be able to sort out the fact that we as humans are incredibly confused in our own brains. And we have ambiguity built into our system and we can't help it. I mean, I'm going to give you a couple of examples, and it's something that I'm struggling with on multiple fronts. But a company whose software has the same name as the company, that's immediately difficult for them to disambiguate. And then the company will create a company profile but talk about the software, or have a software profile and talk about the company. And so however good all of this gets, the people who are actually putting this information out there are making it confusing on their own because it's confused in their own brain. And when you say to, I mean, I've got clients who do this, I've got a few clients actually who have software and company same name. And when I say to them, when you say that, do you mean the company or the software? They can't actually tell me. They have to think about it. And that's a problem. And we were talking, a really expansive problem about it is, as human beings, we don't have much imagination. That's a problem from this point of view. And coming back to another example that I'm working on with my experiments that I'm doing on the knowledge graph, Google's knowledge graph in particular, is Buwa and Kuala, which were the characters I created with my wife years ago. They're characters. We named a song after them because they have to have a theme tune. Then we named a movie after them. Then we named a TV series, also called Buwa and Kuala. Then there's a song, the song is in French, the song is in English. So we have at least 6 entities with exactly the same name. And the context of each one of them, I've actually created a page for each on my site. And even on the pages on my site, when I'm making an effort to make that context incredibly clear, it still isn't clear. And I read it back. I wrote them 3 months ago. I read them back this morning. It's still rubbish. And so as a human being, I'm having trouble disambiguating and expressing clearly which one of those 6 incredibly, very, very closely related entities that have the same name are. They have the same label, as Hamlet was saying earlier on. That label is exactly the same for each and every one, and I'm incapable of being clear about it.
That's awesome. And again, for the audience, and I'm going to come back to each of you, basically what we are putting together here is a very complex picture, which shows why SEO and search are so difficult sometimes. They're driven by mathematics, which is very precise. They're driven by definitions, which is scientific and also very precise. But the whole thing is used by humans and human behavior, which is imprecise. And search engines, actually, although they are mathematical in nature, try to understand human behavior, which is really, really difficult to understand at the best of times. And I think we're getting now to the stage as technology gets better and better and better at basically indexing and understanding the context of content we create. We're getting to the stage where we need to be able to clarify perhaps human behavior, where context comes into it. And behind context, of course, is intent. So with that, I'm going to go again, starting from Don this time, where I would ask Don to tell us a little bit about how human behavior, context and intent, and how these drive now the evolution of search and how they have an impact on the knowledge graph.
Well, ultimately, I think much of what we've discussed here and the answer regarding intent comes down to what Susan DeMace has, famously called the vocabulary problem. So, and it kind of expands a little bit on what Jason said, but touching on intent is that lots of people, so many people have a different way of saying exactly the same thing that they mean. Yeah. So search is kind of not a solved problem. I saw a really interesting analogy the other day written by somebody who writes a lot about search in the academic stroke practitioner field on semantics, and he said search is not a solved problem. It is like trying to understand where somebody is going and what they want to do in New York from seeing them step off the plane at JFK. So I thought that was a really good analogy, and really intent is about trying to guess with some educated probability determinations based on past data, etc., but also gathering on other signals as you go along. And that's why there's the whole notion of search result diversification on very broad terms, because if somebody types a single word in to search, they're giving really no clue as to what their intent is. So if somebody types dresses in, what do they want? Do they want black dresses? Do they want long dresses? Do they want prom dresses? So that's why I know a lot of people get upset about Google keeping people in their search results, but that is user feedback. They need that, because that's why universal search is there, and that's why they have search result diversification, a mix of different types of possible intent matches, so that people can give them explicit feedback in the things that they click around on, if you like, until finally they achieve a goal and hopefully meet somebody's intent. So I hope that answers that a little bit.
It goes some way towards answering that, certainly. And I'll take the same question to Andrea. And let's keep in mind, Andrea's company also deals with artificial intelligence, which even from a philosophical point of view, has to try and guess human behavior and try to quantify it. So Andrea, please. So
I think that in the end, yes, information is ultra complex because humans are ultra complex, and when you design a system, you always have to take into account that you need to create a feedback loop. So my lesson is that whenever you're talking about whatever type of AI approach you want to use, you always have to keep the human in the loop, because that's what actually creates the value. And we can do this by creating ontologies. So as I was reading also among the questions that we have Larry that ask about, the definition of ontology. And I think the ontologies is somehow an answer, because it's a way in which you can, at the philosophical point, from the philosophical point of view, it's the study of the things. So it's the way in which you can study the reality and the study of whatever exists. But then within the concept of technology, an ontology is what allows you to create a system that gets the machine, engaged with the human and creates a value that otherwise would not exist, which is given by the interaction of the human and the machine.
Okay, I guess brilliant. And I think since you mentioned ontologies, and we have a question from the audience, Larry Swanson is asking us to circle back a little bit to ontology and try to get to a clearer definition. Let's take that to Hamlet. Perhaps you tell us.
Yeah, I like to be the layman's translator here, right? So we get from the nerdy, level, of the brilliant minds here to, a layman like me, can translate that. So organization, right? So when you think about ontologies, when you think about how do you organize things when we have so much ambiguity, as we mentioned, right? How do you know that when that person wrote that, what exactly in that organization, think about, in a library, think about the shelves in a library, right? Where does that fit in, if that can be expressed in a lot of different ways? And when we go about search, and I wrote an article for SEJ a couple of weeks ago on talking about the searches that Google has never seen. Google says 15% of the searches they see every day are completely new, that they haven't seen before. So how do you build a system that can answer questions that have never been asked before? That's how difficult it is, right? And I perform an experiment on an article that I published. I'll post a link to find, a sliver of those questions from Google Search Console data. And when I review personally from a client that is a nonprofit, I reviewed the queries that were showing up that had never been showing up in Search Console. I found some really interesting trends. And one of the things that I found is, for example, I found searches for businesses that didn't exist before, just completely new businesses that came in the spotlight. In Google, when the search was for a business, Google was able to show the local packs, the Google Maps results. The searches were not really good, the results, because there was not a lot of content around it. And that's what I highlighted that as an opportunity. But Google was able to identify that query, even though it hasn't seen it before, called for a maps list, right? Another query, that was related to news results, called for published, for articles to be showing up, right? So even though it hasn't seen it before, it knew to classify them in the right buckets, the ontology, to say these type of searches demand images, right? This one demand video, this one require map links, right? That's why that is valuable, right? Being able to organize things into, a hierarchy, of information, and being able to identify that quickly, right? That's the value of that, right? So it's a way to organize things in a way that machines can pull them really quickly.
Yeah, when I was talking to Nathan Chalmers from Bing, who's the guy who runs the whole page algorithm, which, Dawn, you were talking about click-through data and user behavior, and the whole thing that kind of Google was saying, well, we're not using click data, we're not using user behavior. But what I found interesting about what Nathan was saying.
Feedback, don't they? They admit that they use it for feedback and.
Yeah, but what struck me about that, was they use it from a whole page algorithm. Nathan Chalmers at Bing, at least. I mean, Google have never talked about it to me at any rate. Is saying we use it extensively to understand what the whole page should actually look like. So I think kind of that whole idea of using that user data. I mean, there's no way they can't use it. But then that comes back what Nathan was saying to me to what Hamlet's saying, which is how do they address something they've never seen before? And I think a lot of us as human beings just cannot begin to understand how much data they have and how much they actually have a foot to stand on with them, with machine learning since in recent years, to be able to double guess what this is going to mean. I mean, it's outside of anything I can begin to imagine, but I can get the concept. I'm sure one of you can explain it better than I am, that the sheer mass of data and user behavior from previous examples will give them a good foothold to be able to predict what something they have never seen before is actually aiming to do. And from Bing's point of view, just some from Hamlet, Bing, when I talked to them, was saying 15% they feel is vastly overestimated as a percentage, but that's Bing.
Well, I can tell you that I think you're in the right track on thinking about using historical performance, because on the experiment that I performed, I said, look, how can I know in the article that I published that I found these 15% of searches? I mean, I found these queries that haven't been seen before on the Search Console data. In my case, my test was 4%. So maybe Bing is right in that Google might be overestimating it. I found it at about 4% in data set, but it's just a small example, and it was just a year's worth of data, not the whole, length of the Google has. But I said, look, how can I predict whether these searches are going to be popular? Mm-hmm. And what I did is I look at the historical data and I matched them semantically. So I said, okay, even though these phrases haven't been seen before, I'm going to convert them into embeddings. And I'm going to look at the historical keyword phrases and also turn them into embeddings, and then do a similarity match numerically using, embeddings to find phrases that are that showed off historically, not typed the same way, but that they mean the same. And then I use that to say, okay, this is what this is, because I'm matching it semantically to something that I have seen before.
Can we, if we were to take all of this into a practicality now and just sort of boil down to a couple of very practical things, and let's suppose that, for argument's sake, that the audience we have isn't able to devote the time or hasn't got the necessary technical skills to do what you just mentioned, Hamlet, or to sort of go into a lot of technical SEO stuff. And what they can do is usually create content. So if we take what you said and boil it down to a content creation guideline, if I take 1 point from each of you, starting with Dawn, please, and then we're going to go to Andrea.
Well, really building quickly on what Hamlet has said is that whilst 15% of queries will never have been seen before, there will be some seasonal aspects that you can begin. I mean, for me, I would literally say, think about what's happening throughout the whole of the year for your audience, and you can map the content you're going to need probably for much of the time with a great calendar. Okay. Great. So, yeah.
I was going to say, let's keep it as short as possible, so the sort of point-driven. Andrea, please.
Seasonality is definitely one aspect. I believe that also it's super important that you talk with your actual clients or reader every now and then. You kind of shape the content model accordingly. That's the practical things that I would recommend today. Talk with the people that make the search if you have the chance to do it.
Okay, how would you do that? I mean, from a practical point of view.
A lot of the times you really have the chance to speak with your consumer, with your clients, and they just arrive to you because they made a search. So ask everyone, how they got to you and what did they search, because then you understand, the type of mindset that people have, and then you can shape the content model that you're working on. And rarely people do that, because we think that the internet is something else, but it's made of people. And then maybe you send up a contract and they jumped on your site because they made a query. And what was the query? Why they arrived? Okay, great. Let's take this to Jason, please.
For content writing, my number one top go-to thing is disambiguate. Take a big step back every time you write something. Take the time to actually think about it and rewrite it to the point at which it isn't ambiguous, or you can make it as least ambiguous as possible, at least for Google. But don't ever forget, as Andrea said, the web is made up of people who are actually coming to your website. So make sure that you keep it sexy, attractive for them. And I'm very much a believer that simplicity in text or clarity in text, disambiguation within your copy doesn't necessarily, for the machine, doesn't mean that it has to be boring and dull and uninteresting for the human being. It's a question of writing skills, and that's what I love is great content writers are back.
Right. Okay. And Hamlet, and for the audience, I'd like to say that Hamlet has also shared a link to an article he wrote on Search Engine Journal. Sorry.
Yeah. So if you can click on the link and scroll to about the middle, where I have some search features. My simple recommendation is that we get used to be using the keyword tools, and we spend a lot of time. So I'm a tool builder, so a lot of people used to, and we don't spend the time to do the search and look at what is showing up in the search results. So something simple as that. Just take that query, that you pull from SEMrush or Search Console, whatever, type it into Google, and if your audience is in a different location, right? You can use tricks with the developer tools to set that location, right? So you can pretend to be in that location, type that search, and even set your browser in that language. I was giving a Spanish presentation, and Spanish is my first language, but I have all my stuff set in English. So I set up everything in Spanish, and I learned a lot just by typing, and putting the interface in the language of my user, typing the query, and seeing what's showing up, what Google thinks this is about, what people think this is it, because it's going to give you ideas of what it is that they're searching for, and also what the competitors are offering, and whether they're getting it right or wrong. If they're not getting it right, it's an opportunity for you to get it right.
Excellent. And sort of summarizing all this, know your audience, create your content, and please test some of the search queries before you create your content and finalize it. And I love this. I think you brought in very, very nice pointed bullet points to this. Okay, so on the basis of this now, let's ask a two-pronged question. What are the skills that SEO professionals need to have today? And as you answer that, hopefully we'll be able to see some of the skills perhaps that non-SEO professionals who are on the web, try to do their own SEO, try to promote their business, can sort of learn a little bit from this and see what they can do. And let's start this one with Jason, please.
I think the principal skill has to be communication. Whether it's writing, making videos, you need to communicate with your audience. You need to communicate with the machine. In the case of SEO, it's Google and Bing, and make sure that Google and Bing. I wrote an article in Search Engine Journal, just like Hamlet. I'm terribly pleased. All about understanding credibility and deliverability, and for me, that's the crux of everything we're doing. We need to make sure that Google has understood who we are, what we offer, who our audience is. We need to make sure that once it's understood that we have an offer that's appropriate for the intent of its user, that we're the most credible solution for Google to present as the recommendation for its users, because that's what it's doing. It's recommending a result or an answer or a solution. And thirdly, make sure we have it in the format that's deliverable. I think it was Dawn who mentioned earlier on the rich results, the universal results. If the videos are appearing, obviously you need to make it's a great idea to have video. Sometimes video is the best format. Sometimes writing is the best format. Sometimes podcasts are the best format. But if you can get those three pillars together, make sure Google's understood who you are, what you offer, who your audience is, that you're more credible as a solution, more reliable as a solution than your competition, and that you have the content in the deliverable format, either on the SERP so that Google can deliver it, or that Google believes you can deliver it, which will be all the technical SEO stuff on your site, like site speed and so on and so forth, then you're going to win the game. Right. Okay. Dawn, to you, please.
Well, first and foremost, I would say that, I'm doing quite a bit of research at the moment into the notion of zip fee and distribution and Zipf's law. And I think the principle of that is ultimately there will be a small amount of things that are massively important and many long tail things that are not that important, but there are many of them, a little bit like the very long tail queries, 15%, 4%, or whatever that we spoke about. So I think the key is to make sure you're really, really clear on what matters the most to your audience. Focus very much on that. And as Jason just alluded to, focus on the right medium for your audience. For instance, if you are working with a fashion client, or you're in the fashion space, images are probably much more important than words because it's very image-led. Fitness is video. So don't limit yourself thinking that it's always just got to be about words per se. So consider Pareto and Zipf law in all of the things that you do. Yeah. So.
Excellent. That's brilliant. Andrea, please.
So data publishing is always my answer to these. So my obvious answer is publish data. So make sure that that you're dealing not only with the searcher in the form of a human being, but in the searcher in the form of a machine that will help the human being get to you. So in order for the machine to understand you, publish as much data in the most possible clean and accessible way so that you can be understood by the searcher and by the agent that helps the searcher get to you. Excellent.
That's brilliant. And Hamlet, please.
Yeah, and I agree with Jason that I think the most important skill is communication, right? So you need to be able to communicate really clearly. And a lot of times, one of the problems that I see is that we as SEOs, we start, even when talking to clients, we're talking about a bunch of different, page authority and stuff, and link juice and stuff like that, like terms that clients don't understand or they can't connect directly with business value. And I think on clarity of communication in everything, what you're doing, and also in the writing of the content. I will tell you a short story about a prospect I just, talked last week. It was, we have all this, content, and he's getting some performance, but he doesn't feel, he feels like something is missing. And it's because when he went to a website, he says, I went to this, he's a manufacturer, and he went to a website about guitars, and he got excited about the content. And he saw the authors and the videos and stuff like that. He says, I don't feel that way when I go to my website with the content that I'm being told to put in, without even, and you look at it, not even authors associated with it, right? And I say, you have to communicate clearly and you have to deliver, right? Make sure that you're delivering to your clients. Make sure that when people search, that when they click, they're gonna be satisfied, right? Because that's gonna be the next step. A lot of SEOs, we just say, oh, I just got the ranking, right? And the ranking is there, but nobody's clicking to begin with because I'm not even paying attention to the search snippet, what the search snippet says, right? People have to click and the search snippet has to be compelling. Now they get to the page, the page has to deliver. What you promise in the search snippet has to deliver. And I think everything else, the technical side, which I spend a lot of time, can be learned really easy, but those are the foundational things that you need to make sure that you have.
Excellent, that's brilliant. So basically, in one word, summarizing everything, and again, you gave a fantastic sort of a layered approach to all this. Communication, right? And communication, we know from at a human level, it's really difficult. When we factor in machine and a machine interface that acts as a translator, it becomes even harder. So clarity and clarification are really, really important. Okay.
And consistency.
And consistency, thank you. And,
consistency.
that is very, very good, very true, and very good to add this. So we see in search that increasingly machine learning is being used. The introduction of artificial intelligence in a very sort of constrained sort of definition is being employed. So search is accelerating in terms of how it changes, how it evolves, and the amount of indexing it does. How does this all affect the creation of knowledge graphs, the impact of knowledge graphs, and what is new in that sort of arena? So let's start with Andrea in this case, partner, please.
So a lot of the new things are related with, as we discussed, with the new language models that are capable of synthesizing information. And so we see that the knowledge graph, it's evolving very fast because it grabs now unstructured information and can compile it into triples by just using, something like, we discussed about T5 and other, evolution of that these language models that can compress information from being, you know, unstructured, and then structure it inside the knowledge graph. And that's what we see, you know, with the experiment that we do with JSON, that a lot more information is coming up from the open web. Whether before we've seen, you know, a higher importance from the structured sources like, you know, the Wikipedia, and of course the Crunchbases, the LinkedIn. These are still relevant, but more information is being sourced by the open web. And this is an opportunity for everyone that it's writing, you know, to be consistent and to help the machine understand, you know, what can be triplified, what are the information that really matters out there.
Okay.
And then, of course, as we said, as a data publisher, it's important that, you know, we get the information accessible and interoperable with other data sets, so that, you know, graphs can evolve.
Excellent. And I think, again, I think the very fact that you mentioned consistency here is important, and we'll circle back to this, because it's a very sort of applicable sort of practice at a very sort of universal level. So let's go to Don, please. Again, checking to see how machine learning and AI is influencing search and affecting the knowledge graphs.
I think ultimately what's happening is over time things will just get increasingly more and more accurate, if you like. We've talked about consistency there. We do see a lot of inconsistency still, and I think interestingly the other week when Google had their event, it was the search on event, they talked about the Google data sets that they have out there now. There is no shortage anymore, if you like, of data out there. In fact, there's almost like data lakes. And in a way, that level of data makes things confusing and easier to be ambiguous in other ways, because you have all these different bodies now creating more and more data banks. And we often see issues with, for instance, where search engines pull in a featured snippet an image from one place. We all know about the issue last year where how many legs does a horse have, and lots of different answers were given about the number of legs horses have.
Yes, I remember that, yes.
Yeah, and that's because obviously there's lots of different data out there, but it's being pulled from like different places. So I think over time, one of the big focuses will probably be around this whole like alignment of data, so accuracy will build. And you know, natural language is complicated, but hopefully over time it'll just get more and more less ambiguous.
Great. Can I ask as a follow-up on this, just for you, you mentioned consistency earlier, and Andrea also echoed that. How would that apply on a practical level? What do we mean by consistency when it comes to content creation or data sort of?
So really, I was going to say, so really kind of, you know, it goes back to the whole NAPS is a really good example, you know, the name, address, phone number type thing. You know, utilizing making sure that the same data for everything, if you like, is online. I often see when somebody changes a brand name, so somebody rebrands, and you end up with some results, some data banks that have the old name, some that have the new name, and you end up with this like confusion where a site seems to rank 1 minute for something and then it gets switched out and it ranks for the other name, or it ranks for a different address. So I think it's just really about practically just keeping in every mention of the entities that are out there.
Awesome.
Just consistency in all naming conventions. Would you agree with that, Jason?
Yeah, sorry, you just inspired something. I think you saw me raise my little hand kind of halfway up like that. But even without changing your brand name, there's an awful problem with consistency in that you've got different employees who place information in different places in different manners, especially over time when your employees have changed over time. I get all my clients to do an audit, to go around the web and find all the information about them and just see how inconsistent it all is. And it's usually a bit of a shock. And then say, go around and correct it all. And the thing about consistency is in my experiments, part of it is I've created an event called CaliCube Tuesdays. and it's an event every week that I live stream to YouTube, and I can now push those into the knowledge graph in 5 minutes or less. They basically go straight into the knowledge graph, which is wonderful and terribly, terribly cool. But then I place it on different platforms, and I spent a lot of time making sure that every single time I mentioned the event, that the title was exactly the same, the description was exactly the same. And Google was still creating duplicates, however careful I was. The machine is obviously kind of still learning, so it's obviously this still learning process. But one thing is, however consistent you are, the machine is still having a certain number of problems, but that doesn't mean to say give up on being consistent, because it's the only way we're going to get anywhere near getting the machine to understand and disambiguate and make things clear for it. And in terms of machine learning, Frederic Debout from Bing talked to me about kind of how he perceives it. I like the way he was saying is what we're doing, or what they are doing, is they give the machine a big chunk of data that they've checked and they've sorted and they've made sure that it's all categorized correctly. And then they say, okay, and this data goes to this goal. And they give the machine a goal of great results, or a goal of whatever it might be. And then take the data that the machine has then produced from trying to achieve that goal and feeding it back in, having tagged it either good or bad. So they're encouraging the machine with the good examples, and they're telling it, giving it corrective data with saying this is incorrect, please correct. And generally going through that process of getting the machine. Excuse me?
That's a bandit algorithm. So it's rewarding good,
yeah,
one-armed bandit type thing. Reward.
Oh, I had a donkey with a carrot and a stick.
It's bandit algorithms, yeah.
But I think kind of like the idea of machine learning, if you look at it that way and say that in fact the engineers who are building this stuff are actually just looking at the goal and then they're setting the metrics by which they're judging the machine, and then feeding the data back in to correct the machine as and when it makes mistakes, and to encourage it when it's doing it really well. And that for me just made machine learning, without understanding the details of it, much easier to grasp, and much easier for me as a professional in the marketing industry. And somebody was saying earlier on, I think it's Hamlet, basically what you described earlier on was communicating clearly with our audience is marketing.
Yeah, I think that's awesome. And then with that, we go straight to Hamlet, please. Again, we're talking about machine learning, AI, how they affect.
I would like to do a quick demo. Let me share my screen so I can.
Yeah, by all means.
Practically. There's the share screen. Screen two. Okay. Yeah, so I posted a link to this article where I show you how to build a knowledge graph from scratch. Mm-hmm. And I'll show you quickly. Let me share as well this link so you can open it on. This is actual code, but you just have to hit the play buttons and you'll get this graph, right? And what I did is I took the XML sitemap from SEJ, Search Engine Journal. XML sitemap lists all the articles. I filtered the articles for this year. And then I used the headlines from the URLs. I turned the URLs, the logs from the URLs into headlines. And then from the headlines, I pulled the entities and the relationships, and I built, knowledge graph from this. And this is the relationships, and I'll walk you quickly through what it does. But here you just hit play at the end. And for example, this is the relationship launches. So Search Engine Journal publishes articles, and quickly I'm able to learn what are these articles about. Look how powerful this is. And this is fully automatic. I didn't have to type anything manually. I just put the sitemap, and for the relationship launches, I can see Google launches, high demand fields, blog SEO, Microsoft Marketing O'Clock podcast, Yelp launches local crowd, SEOS coronavirus and coronavirus queries. So look how powerful this is, right? That relationship. And I can do this one is, so we're talking type. Look at that, right? Look how beautiful this is, right? I can improve, right? And you have the code to do this. Look how cool this is, right? So you don't have, there is code here, but you don't have to, you just have to hit play. And I go through the steps here. I wanted to highlight a couple of things here, right? Which is AI. What is machine learning, how machine learning enabled building this graph? And there is a library, and this is using Python code. Python is a simple programming language. I'll share a link for SEOs that has an introduction for Python so you understand the basics. But basically, this is where machine learning makes it a lot simpler to take unstructured text and do NER, right? And then entity recognition. And this is not optimal, right? But it gets at about 60, 70%, which is better than trying to do it manually. But for the purposes of what I show you here, it's very effective. But basically takes text, this is from the headlines, and labels the text with entities, right? It says these are numbers, this is supposed to be a person, which is not correct, organization, product, date, right? And I have this here. This is on this one. Look at that. So I have the code here. And using machine learning, I'm able to do NAR, name entity recognition. And then also I can extract. Then I use a syntactical parser of natural language to find the edges, to find the relationships between the subjects and objects. And with this, right, you see this in practical terms, that I can turn that into something practical that you can use, right? This is a crazy, scary knowledge graph with everything, but that's what I did a filter here by the specific relationship, right? So hopefully you find that useful, right? So I wanted to show you with an example. This is I think I posted the article in the notebook. You have it here. Feel free to see if you have any questions around it.
Okay, that's brilliant.
Yeah, so Larry's asking that Python is important for technical SEOs. You know, yeah, for technical SEOs, I would say you know, mastering the Search Console tools for Google, Bing. They have, you know, like they have a series of videos and academies that you can take to get a good understanding of the fundamentals of how the search engine scroll, index, rank, right? Understanding those concepts and understanding structured data is also very important to understand. A lot of this that we're talking about, structured data can be seen as an ontology, right? Of how Google, how schema, there's some standards that can be used to categorize, organize information, and that a good number of those elements can power rich features in the search results.
Right.
Right.
Okay, so let's now, as we begin to sort of get into past the halfway mark of what we're doing, let's ask for a couple of practical takeaways from all this. I mean, if we're to advise the audience of something very specific they should be looking out for as they're creating content. So let's start with Jason, please.
you're looking for practical advice about content for knowledge graphs.
Yes.
Beyond keeping things simple, being consistent, and not being ambiguous. I mean, one thing I'd like to come back to is Andrea mentioned triples earlier on, and it was Dawn who mentioned to me for the first time semantic triples. And when she said the word to me, I thought, oh, that's a bit too complicated. I don't really understand. And it turns out it's just subject, verb, object. I mean, it's really simple. The subject is related to the object with the verb. And that idea of triples, if you look at it that way as a normal human being who hasn't been looking into all this for years and years and years and years, doesn't read academic papers, subject, verb, object, try to keep your content writing with the subject, verb, object as close together as possible. However good BERT or T5 gets, the closer it is together, the clearer it is, not only for the machines, but for your users.
Excellent. I think that's actually really, really practical and applicable. Thank you.
Yeah, it was thanks to Dawn because she confused me, and then I had to think about it.
Sorry.
Well, I think you made an important point here, inadvertently perhaps. Essentially, our own confusion when it arises becomes a critical point for clarification, which then perhaps we can communicate with our audience. So I think that's pretty good.
So it's not sorry that you should be saying, Dawn. It's my pleasure.
Thank you. Yeah, you should say thank you to Dawn. Okay, let's take this to Andrea, please.
So my practical advice, given also what we discuss, it's data syndication. So I first say data publishing, now I say data syndication. So the more you can make this data available, Jason made an example before about the podcast. You know, you publish the podcast and you are creating data from your site in the form of structured data. Now, this data is foundational for a lot of other platforms. So whether you're publishing on your site or you are creating a feed for Amazon or if you think about e-commerce, you know, the importance of getting, you know, your product metadata in the form of structured data, but also in the form of a merchant feed. So syndicating data, it's really essential, it's practical, and it kind of helps in this ambiguity and helps in creating consistency that the machine require for promoting.
Awesome. That's really good. Dawn, do you please?
Well, one thing I would say is that Hamlet gave a really great example there of how actually just linked pages and linked URLs together can create a form of knowledge graph. So I think people should really be very, very mindful of the way that they link their pages internally. Yeah. And it should be paramount in people's minds. I think, as I say, I'm doing a lot of research at the moment into how zip fee and distribution matters really in the world of SEO, and it matters a lot, it seems. And that's around things like importance and the connection of important things together. So I think might be mindful about your link things. Make sure that you are really strong on those relationships that you connect together within a website, within the sections of a website. How you link things together as well can help a lot with disambiguation. Be mindful of the terminology you use. For instance, one of the sectors that I've got a lot of experiences in is in local search, local services search. And there's often a lot of ambiguity in the difference between a heating engineer and a plumber, because both of them deal with boilers, yeah? Both of them deal with leaking radiators. So if you can, try and keep a very clear separation around terminology that you use in different sections where you detect there could be two ways of saying the same thing or calling something the same name. Like engineer, as we know, is a very, very ambiguous word, particularly in certain fields like, you know, computing, for instance. An engineer is really a developer, but everybody likes to be called an engineer now because it's smarter. An architect is really, historically in Google's mind, somebody who designs houses, but everybody in the IT space is suddenly an architect. So these things are very confusing, given that for many, many years an architect has been, and Wikipedia calls it, somebody who does a house. So be careful how you connect things in terms of internal linking structures. Utilize importance with all of these things as well to signify when something is more important than something else. For instance, there's many Swintons in the UK, but actually some Swintons are much more popular than many long-tail Swintons. So utilize internal linking to emphasize which is the most important of these Swintons. Utilize be careful about ambiguity in words that fit together, heating engineer, plumber, boiler, etc. And try to add a lot of these supporting terms to show search engines, well, this is actually a computer architect versus a house architect.
Cool. That's really good. Thank you. And Hamlet, to you, please.
Yeah, and I want to expand on what Andrea said about syndication, and I want to talk about content formats and repurposing content, right? So a lot of times as content writers, we're in this treadmill of, oh, let me publish 4 articles a day or X number of articles, and more a quantity game. And we said, look, why don't you step back and you said, instead of pushing this, Me Too type of articles that are just regurgitating something else that somebody said, spend a little bit more time, write something original. And because you put so much effort on that, right? Publish it first in video format, right? It could be a webinar, an interview. Now that video, right? You can repurpose the audio of that video into a podcast. That podcast, you can have structured data to take advantage of that stuff. Now that video, that podcast, that audio, you can turn it into an article, right? You can transcribe the content on that article, right? The video content, you can also put slides on a presentation, right? So there's all these different ways that you can repurpose the same information and then get distribution in multiple social networks, multiple knowledge graphs, right? Multiple, that you can accomplish both things just by repurposing higher quality content in different formats instead of the traditional approach of just churning and burning content.
That's an important point. Thank you so much for making this. And essentially, here's a question that arises out of this. And I think, what you said, Hamlet, is really important. And it begs a question. And the question is, how can the average business person who's got a small team, or maybe no team at all, maybe it's just him and his dog, working from a web page, develop that kind of skill set which you just mentioned, which is really important now?
Yeah, and I'll tell you, because I'm a small business, right? And we do this. What I'm telling you is how we approach it, right? And it is because you have the higher value content in the experts, right? So in my business, I have an expert. I have a few people that are experts in my business, right? But they don't need to be the people that are writing or producing the content. You can hire journalist interns that they are the ones who interview the experts. So the experts will block, half an hour, a month, right? And you might have 4 experts. They'll give you content for 1 per week. And the journalists, right? Interns, can be interns, right? Or recent grads, can research interesting questions and ask them in a webinar format, right? To the experts, or in any format you decide internally, extract that expertise from the experts, and they do the write-up because they're journalists. That's what they're trying to do, right? And they do.
There's a budget involved here, right? There's obviously a budget involved, however small, right? Mm-hmm. And there's also a certain level of expertise from you in guiding what you want to achieve.
I completely agree with Hamlet on that. I think there is a massive. I hope you don't mind me interrupting there.
No, not at all.
This is something that's actually annoyed me for quite a while. Mm-hmm. There is almost like a stigma in the SEO world where if somebody doesn't completely spend all of their time writing their own articles, that they should be cast out of the SEO world. But we never say that. Yeah,
I'm out then.
I mean, I wrote my piece on passage indexing, and that took me like over a week. That's why, in reality, I couldn't do one of those every week because I need to earn a living. Yeah. The point is, I think that there is a case to be had for different types of content to delegate parts of that to to people. So they go off and do a lot of the research, gather the data, etc. As long as the full write-up or the full collaboration at the end or the full endorsement of the content is from an expert, if that makes sense.
Yeah,
It does, absolutely. And I think, and again, I think you made a very important point here, but simplifying it even more for an audience that is not really part of the SEO community. They're business people on the web trying to earn a living. They understand the need to do some kind of SEO related activities. They don't have that kind of skill set. They don't have the budget, perhaps. So now what? Are they completely stuck? This is a question.
No, I think that, if I can provide the answer, I think that the real answer is that you need to experiment. Whatever type of business you're doing, you need to experiment, especially nowadays where, you have this evolution of machines. If you want to do something, you need to build an organization, but above all, you really need to love to experiment on new things, because that's what, at least, keeps me alive. And that's what I can imagine keeps Hamlet, writing code, day and night, and then keeps Jason, experimenting with a new way of shaping his family knowledge graph. And I think that's the real secret of the people that, around this panel, is that we all love what we do, and we put a lot of effort that goes way beyond, the expected outcome. It's a lot of enthusiasm and in experimenting new stuff.
yeah. Let me add another point, right? Another example. Trying to take another practical use is, I also like to recommend clients to leverage stuff that they already have, right? So instead of saying, okay, I don't have the time or the budget to allocate just stuff for SEO. Look, you have customer success people, probably, right? Or customer service people, or you have pre-sales people, you have pre-sales. And they have knowledge that is valuable that they're probably only sharing it internally with emails and support chats and stuff like that. Something simple that you want to just get started, create FAQs, right? Just give a task to your people that are from line with your customers to populate a FAQ with an internal wiki, and have a process that, if you don't have somebody to publish it on your website, create an automation with Zapier or something, that will just update it internally, and when they update it, gets published on the website. Maybe they don't have the technical expertise for that, but they could have somebody that once a week, once a month, from the internal wiki of the FAQs that people internally, because that FAQ is valuable for them to service the customer. It's not just for SEO. They need it to be able to answer questions to customers. They publish it on the website, and now the next time the rep has to answer the same question, instead of typing it again, send them the link to the page on the website. That is going to start building value, and they're actually doing two things that are valuable for SEO. They're writing content and they're promoting it because they're sending the links to the customers.
Awesome. And I think that's a really, really important point. And creating a frequently asked questions page.
Even gathering together data from your customer service people based on what are the complaints that we've had? Where are the biggest complaints? Look on Twitter. You'll see a lot of brands get massive amounts of people complaining on social media, but they do nothing about it. Whereas they could actually build a knowledge center, a help subdomain or something, and they could literally say on Twitter, they could have a separate triage support Twitter account and say that actually deals with all the complaints, and it would keep all the ranters off their main social media channels, triage them into support and support. Sorry. Oh,
that's okay. Don't worry.
Dogs.
Yeah. Don't worry. Don't worry.
All right. But anyway, the point is, the content, as Hamlet has very well said, is content takes many forms, and it's not just always the one thing that we expect it to be.
Okay, that's awesome.
Can I add something, David, really quickly?
Yeah, absolutely, of course.
Because that actually goes even further than all of that. Your FAQ for your company. I study brand SERP, so I track 70,000 brands. And people also are coming up more and more. About 30% of all brand SERPs, all searches on exact match brand names, contain people also ask. And those are principally about the brand and about the services of the brand. So you can dominate that and retain control of your brand SERP by answering those. And it now goes even further, because in knowledge panels, we're now getting questions about the brand that are appearing, and brands are not looking after it. But if you have a great FAQ section and you're answering these questions that people are truly answering, Google will put you in control of your own people also ask, and what I'm now calling entity questions, we could call them perhaps, in the knowledge panel, that such as price, what's your mission statement, you know, where do you apply for a job in a company? Those are appearing in knowledge panels, and an FAQ, a good FAQ that's detailed and covers most of the common questions, will dominate.
Excellent. Okay, so we have a couple of questions from the stream. One is from Larry Swanson. He's asking, Hamlet in particular, is there any risk of duplicate content issues with repurposing? Let's keep in mind that duplicate content as an issue has been one of the most frequently asked questions in the SEO world since search engines.
Yeah, I want to clarify that there is this, I would say, myth that duplicate content, oh, you're going to get penalized because of duplicate content, which used to be the case really back in the day when people were just doing it on purpose. They were repurposing, you know, deliberately duplicating, you know, information or copying it or scraping sites. There's still some of that. But for the most part, when you're talking about, you know, duplicate content without, you know, that nefarious, you know, approach, I haven't seen a penalty on duplicate content in many years. So what happens with duplicate content is that you get your content diluted. So if you have
you're competing with yourself, yeah.
Yeah, when you don't canonicalize the content, your rankings get diluted and your performance is not optimal, right?
Could I? Oh, sorry.
Yeah.
So I was just going to say the thing about the Panda updates, the Panda penalties. It's all about what's it called? Oh, I've forgotten the word now. Plagiarism. Plagiarism's the problem. It isn't the fact that the content's exactly the same. It's that people are plagiarizing other people by scraping their content, stealing it, and using it themselves, pretending it's their own. And the other point is, if you've got a duplicate, one of which is a video and the other of which is text, it's not a duplicate in the sense that the video will sometimes be more appropriate and the text will sometimes be more appropriate, depending on the platform and the kind of content the person likes to consume. Sorry, Hamlet, I'll hand back to you.
I was going to say, can I just add to that quickly, Hamlet? Sorry, I was going to say, the issue really is not duplication, it's the use of shingles. You know, there's a lot of stitching. There's a lot of content now that is dynamically generated just to kind of try to be.
Yeah, but that's deliberate spam, right? So that's
it's spam, it's web spam. Yeah, that's my point. Yeah, there's
we're talking about what, you know, Jason said, right? Different people want to consume the content in different ways. Right? I don't necessarily want to watch a video. I don't want to necessarily want to listen to it, right? You're providing more convenience. Yes. You're broadening your audience because not everybody wants to consume the same content in exactly the same way, right? So you're actually doing a good service to your audience by repurposing your content in different formats and feeding that content to the person that wants the presentation. Here it is, the webinar, the podcast, the written, you know, transcript. Though you're doing a favor to them. So that's not.
Yeah, exactly.
And also breaking a big piece of content down into little pieces of content isn't necessarily a bad idea, in the sense that the whole thing is not necessarily interesting to somebody. Just one small chunk of it might be interesting. And then once again, as Hamlet says, you're doing your audience a favor by saving them time having to go through the whole lot to find that one important point that they were interested in.
Okay, we have one more question from the audience. This is Jeannie Hill, and she's asking Hamlet again, how do you feel about using a frequently asked questions page as a nested schema in addition to a dedicated FAQ page?
Yeah, and I would say that I haven't run that experiment, but it's good to experiment. When you say nested, I assume that you're talking about inside another element, like a product page or a web page, right? So you just have to test it, right?
I've done the testing.
Like a problem. Doesn't sound like a problem.
His experiment.
Well, it is kind of a problem, if I can say, because so the problem with nesting content inside different types is that of course an FAQ is a specific type. So if you match an FAQ, for instance, with a software app, you basically are adding value to the original content type. But if you do that, for instance, with a news article, so if you start like kind of diluting your news article with a lot of FAQ, what will happen, or what I saw happening, is that Google will treat the content no longer as news. So you will lose the visibility as soon as you start combining FAQ markup within the context of news article. You will reduce the visibility across the news surfaces, so the Google News and the Google Discover, because the content is perceived as an FAQ or as an hybrid, which works perfectly for evergreen or for things like software app or local business, but it doesn't work well with news type of content.
So that emphasizes
is that what Jeannie's saying? Is that what she's trying to ask?
Yeah. I mean, well,
right, okay. I just wasn't sure whether I'd interpreted that correctly.
Yeah, and that's what that emphasizes, because maybe, you know, your site is a product site, right? So that's where you have to test it, right? Test it and see how that affects, and do it at small scale in a number of pages of your site, right? That's if you need help with the testing, that's what my company does on that, on the edge. But basically, that's the idea, right? So try it and see how it affects, taking into consideration experiments that, you know, Andrea has already run.
Excellent.
So, Andrea, are you saying there that ultimately, if somebody uses on a product page FAQ schema, that it could be problematic?
No, on a product pages, I always have seen a good result, because it usually, you know, an FAQ will expand the number of intents that the page can capture. But I have a lot of, you know, experience in the news and media publishing. And so when FAQ started to appear on the SERP, of course, all of my clients started to use it in a very proactive form. And then we saw that as the number of FAQ increased, then we decrease the traffic coming from the news surfaces. So again, Google News and Google Discover and the top stories, because the content was no longer recognized as newsworthy as soon as it became kind of more related to the FAQ part.
So the intent was completely different.
It's slightly different. It's good for a product, though, because, I mean, you might have a lot of questions for your product, and you can use FAQ to kind of respond to these questions. But for a news article, it's not a good approach. So right now, my suggestion is to plug in FAQ after, you know, the first 2 weeks or 3 weeks of the news, as you consolidate the content with other content pieces that you might have, you can then start adding FAQ.
Okay, I think that's brilliant. And I think the point Andrea is making is that search is becoming increasingly good at recognizing the nature of a page. So instead of just looking at the content on a page, it sees its nature, which then determines how it treats that page. This is something we need to keep in mind.
It forces you to think about content model, right? So you think, okay, what am I building? Because also, like, FAQ is good because, as Hamlet said, we can repurpose it across different, you know, application. And for instance, we developed now a chatbot for our users, and we feed it with FAQ that you find on the website. So it is all good because it's all about repurposing, but you have to get the right intent. You know, you cannot just miss.
Another thing to know is that search engines are always experimenting, and this might be the case now during the experiments that Andrea's changed, but that doesn't mean that it's going to be the same tomorrow or a few months out.
Yeah, totally.
So that's why, you know, testing things is a good thing to make sure that they're beneficial for you.
Excellent. So how to I see that Jenny has another question about how to page. I think how to are less attractive in terms, I mean, for my personal experience, in terms of, you know, enticing clicks, because they are, again, even a more specific content type.
Yeah, they provide all the information up front, right?
Yeah.
Yes. And we talked now, funnily enough, again, we went from technical stuff to human behavior, back to technical stuff and back to human behavior. We're talking about intent now and how content is perceived, which leads maybe to a new question about practicalities. If you're creating content on your website, and I think Andrea made a very important point when he mentioned about the content model. So how do you go about deciding the content model? Question one. And the follow-up question on that is, as you create content, how do you go about deciding how to create a taxonomy of that content so it actually begins to make deeper sense? So let's start with Andrea on this one, please.
Yeah, so I can quickly share the screen. Let's see if you can see my screen. And I will be quick, but I show you a little bit of an anticipation of tomorrow. So this is the embeddings of a knowledge graph that I have built out of George's latest article on ZDNet.
Okay.
So this is a very fast and simple way for me to start looking at the way in which George perceives concepts. So I can see that knowledge, it's within the context of the latest article that George has written on ZDNet, it's highly related to artificial intelligence and to Gary Marcus that it's also participating at this event. And I can also use these, embeddings, for instance, to start organizing the things that George writes about, and unbias, George, and try to put for instance, in the context of an entity like knowledge, I can see on the right side, the concepts that are most likely related to Google, and on the left side, or sorry, in this case, on the downside, Google, and on the upside, things that are related to Microsoft. And so you see that Microsoft, when George writes about it, it's more closely related to, let's say, investment, but whether, in regards to Google, of course, there is more reference to the Google Cloud Platform, the software as a service, and of course, the deep learning. So you can see that I can start shaping the content using the knowledge graph that I'm creating for the site.
Excellent. Okay, that's brilliant. And I think that's a great question. And how would you go about creating an ontology? So if you start to create content, or if you're guiding the creation of content, perhaps you need to have a clear idea of how to structure it. What should be your starting point?
So my starting point is to use the schema.org vocabulary and the interpretation that Google has of the vocabulary. So as we said, how does Google sees the FAQ content? What is an FAQ for Google? Because that's the way in which I want to organize the content on my site. So if I have an area for users that contains all the frequently asked questions, then I'm going to use the FAQ markup and the structure of the FAQ markup that it's built in schema, just in the way in which Google interprets it. And the same I will do it with the how-tos. So what is an how-to in the schema.org vocabulary, and how Google sees the how-to, and that's exactly what I want to do. I just want to model my content on what the search engine is expecting from me.
Excellent. I think for the audience, I'd say you practice empathy for a second.
Yeah, in a way.
For search engine, right? So you've got to think, how does a search engine?
You have to.
Yeah.
You can start from the vocabulary, which is kind of the golden rule, but then the vocabulary is interpreted, and so now, and as Hamlet said, this interpretation varies across time. So now FAQ is interpreted in a way, maybe tomorrow is interpreted in a different way, and then of course it's content specific.
Yes.
So in an e-commerce site, an FAQ has a value, outside has a complete different value.
Excellent. Anybody else wants to add something from the panel, Jason?
Well, coming on from what Andrea was saying, it actually kind of just brings to mind the experiment that Andrea mentioned earlier on is all around the podcast. And what I realized very quickly when we sat down to say, how can we present this to Google? And Andrea said, let's look at the schema markup. Let's get that up on the table. I realized that I was presenting it very badly. It wasn't structured, it wasn't clear. And I actually got an illustration done, and I was going to show it on screen, but I can't remember how to actually share my screen anymore.
Top left.
Top left.
Plus sign.
Oh, right. Brilliant. Genius. Right. Sharing my screen. And it's this illustration. Basically, it was to set out exactly what it is we're doing, and this is what Andrea just mentioned about the schema markup, and using the schema to define how it is we're presenting it. We have a podcast episode right there in the middle, the lowdown on EAT strategy. We have a contributor who is Lily Ray. We talk about expertise, authority, and trust. We have a production company. We have a person who's the director, and it's part of the Jason Barnard series. And all of that, when you look at that, you suddenly realize what are the, once again, attributes and the properties of this specific episode. And it's more complex than I had initially thought. And I had organized it badly, and it is now very well organized. And we'll see where the experiment goes with this. But the idea is to push this entire podcast series and all the people associated with it into Google's knowledge graph.
Excellent.
Yeah, I want to add something as well. So see if I can share my screen as well here. So this is, if you can check slide 39 in this presentation. So this is another an alternative look at the content production from the perspective of gaps. So this is about looking in the SERPs, right? What people are searching, and that's using the search features. In this case, I use SEMrush API. In this presentation, the process is describe how I came to this. But basically for this client, I look at the structured data in the pages of what were the content that were marked up in the structured data, and in the SERPs for the keywords that page is ranking for. I look at what people are what is the demand, and what this is doing is looking at the gap, right? And you see here in yellow, I'm coloring the opportunity, which means that there is search for that format, but the page doesn't contain the format. And that's another way to look at your content development, because in this case for this client, when I show them, look, you have a lot of demand for video content, but you're not satisfying it. These are product pages. This is an e-commerce website. And the biggest opportunities, as you can see here, are video. And then you see images, high quality images as well, and FAQs. So with this process, I was able to determine ahead of time that when they write the content, there is already demand for it, so that the success chance is higher, right? I want to share Excellent. That. So I posted a link, so you have it. It's slide 39 on that presentation.
That's brilliant. And on the question of content and content creation, we have a question from Larry Swanson in the stream, and he's addressing this to Andrea, and he's asking, it seems like designing content for schema.org might not always be the best way to address user intent. How do we balance the needs of Google and schema with the needs of the user who comes to a website? Andrea?
Yeah, I mean, I always start from the business perspective. So if the business perspective is to, create a positive ROI from Google as a channel, then of course we want to look at the way in which schema is interpreted by Google, and that varies over time. So schema, it's way too generic to be the sole structure for your content model. You need to add your own business needs and understanding of the business personas, and then you need to understand how Google is interpreting a specific element. Just to give you an example, we're now starting to run an experiment with a team in Google that it's trying to test a new markup for video objects outside of YouTube, and so it's important that as content owners we try to understand the way in which Google will render these markups, because we want to understand if there is a point in taking advantage or not. We also might decide that we want to draw a line and say, hey, this is only premium data, and I'm not going to share it with Google because it's not going to benefit. And we can see, for instance, in the case of how-to that, we might not have a real advantage in building too many how-tos because we might get less clicks. Rarely is the case, but we have to interpret the way in which the platform that our user is using, it's interpreting the vocabulary. And so in the case of a video object, at the moment, you are way much more limited when you publish video outside of YouTube than when you're using YouTube. And so this experiment that we're now doing is try to kind of fill this gap and say, hey, what can we do for a content owner that doesn't use YouTube because it has proprietary content? And how can we kind of make this content more accessible through search?
Excellent. Okay, that's brilliant. Now we're getting near the close of this. So essentially, I'd like to open up a question to all of you, and we'll go in turn. We've talked about intent and how we basically try to understand it, try to mine it. If you were to give a tip to content creators on how they would best understand user intent, what would that tip actually be? And let's begin with this one with Jason, please.
Well, I'm curious about the idea of kind of trying to double guess Google on the idea of user intent. Theoretically, if you've, as Dawn said earlier on, if you've talked to the sales people, if you've talked to the marketing people, if you've talked to the after sales people and the client support people, you should really understand your audience and what they're looking for. What are their problems? What are their pain points? Where can you actually bring a solution that is viable for them? The intent is actually, as far as I'm concerned, at least within your business. And part of my approach would be to say, understand your own business, which Andrea was saying, understand your own business and push it out there. And you want to be there when your customer needs you or your potential customer needs you. And I tend not to over-obsess with how Google deals with intent.
Okay. Hamlet, please.
Yeah, and I like that recommendation from Jason. I'd like to expand that. You know, the same thing that I mentioned, right? Get out of the tools, right? So your competitors are just obsessed with the tools and looking at all the information. Spend time gathering that inside knowledge, right? From within your, you know, when you look at the bigger companies that you're competing with, they don't have the time or the scale to do one-on-ones, you know, with, you know, internally and gather that insight knowledge that you only get with the one-on-one interactions, right? Get customer, you know, give an incentive for your customers to get to you in a call every month, every week, so that you learn about their what they're caring about, what are the things that they really need, and see if you can actually watch them. There are tools that you can use to monitor, to play sessions. Microsoft launched one is Microsoft Clarity, that you can replay sessions of users on the website. You can learn from them when they type in your internal search, see, right, they came from Google, they came from whatever on your website, they're using the internal search. Just by watching them and seeing what they're doing, you can extrapolate what is it that they're looking for, what is it, and whether you're doing you're a good job at delivering, which is what we were talking before, right? So intent, internal knowledge, watching your customers, talking to your frontline reps, employees that are dealing with it, and gathering that information. That's going to give you far more information and more valuable than what you're going to get from just being stuck in the tools. I'm not saying that you don't do the tools, but just spend time out of them as well.
Okay,
right?
That's a good tip. Okay, Dawn?
I would say literally the SERPs, because search engines have enough data to have more or less figured out, to a large extent, taking into consideration search result diversification. But even with search result diversification, there is usually, when you start to look at the results in return as a response to a query, you can work out the different intents in descending order. And given that that's probably based on probability from past data and a prediction for future intent, then I would say the SERPs are probably a really great place to spend a lot of your time. And I spend as much of my time in the SERPs looking at search results as I do in the tools. So that's excellent. And it's free. I would give that recommendation to anybody. See what search engines are returning, first and foremost.
That's a very good tip. And Andrea, last one, please.
I think we have to be very critical of our own data. You know, a lot of the marketing is about you know, looking at the data as a way to confirm the theory. But I think we should, you know, when we start doing the opposite is when we really learn. when we start looking at things that don't match or things that don't work the way we wanted, then we learn something new that it becomes effective in understanding the intent of the user.
That's brilliant. That's fantastic. And what a high, that's a really good note to finish with. That's excellent. We basically covered a lot of stuff which has to do with knowledge graphs, semantic web, semantic search, practices, ontologies, and a lot of the practical applications on that. Just checking to see if there's any final questions from the audience, which we can address here. And if there isn't, I would just say, guys, thank you so much. Where would we find you if we need to see where you are? If I give you a little bit of time for each one to say where you can be found and where you can be followed, I think this is going to be very important to the audience. Let's start with Dawn, please.
Dawnando on Twitter or via my website, which is bertey.com, bertey.com. Usually the best places.
Excellent, that's brilliant. Andrea, you're next, please.
Yeah, CyberAndy on Twitter and WorldLift.io. It's the company I run.
Brilliant, it's fantastic. Hamlet, please.
Yeah, it's Hamlet Batista in Twitter, and I'll put it in the chat. And my company is ranksense.com.
Brilliant. And finally, Jason, please.
Yeah, I mean, I'd love to say to everybody, come along to calicube.pro. It's my site, but it's actually a research experiment into brand SERPs, what appears when somebody searches a brand name. Please put your brand in, or your competitors or your friends' brands in, put people in, put music groups. I've got 2,000 music groups, 3,000 events, any entity. It's become an entity tracking system. And the idea, it's all free, is because I want to understand. And I want to get a better understanding of how brand SERPs work. And if you can help me by filling up the database with relevant brands, that would be cool. And if not, find me on Twitter at Jason M. Barnard.
Great. If you wouldn't mind also putting your Twitter handles on the stream on the chat. I think most of you have actually done it. Okay, that's brilliant. So that everybody else can follow you.
I just copied Andrea.
Okay, Andrea led on that chart. That's brilliant. Okay.
Okay. Well, just thank you all, and thanks David for moderating. That was really great. I learned a few things, and just wrapping up from the on behalf of the organization team, I just wanted to point out that in addition to what you all just shared, so Twitter handles, and so people can follow up and keep up with what you do. I also just shared the link to the next workshop, which is again extended panel format, which is coming up, which is on AI and knowledge. So the intersection of knowledge, graphs, and AI, and how can one help the other, which is also going to be super interesting. Thanks, everyone. Thanks for all of you who made it such a great conversation. Thanks to the people who attended and everyone behind the scenes who made sure things worked. And I think they mostly did. So, yeah, if you don't have anything else to add, I think we have to wrap up about here because we also have to start the next session soon.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks all. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.